it emerged gradually and formally became a lab group a little over a year ago, I think. And we're calling it the Religion, Experience, and Mind Lab Group. It was named by the graduate students who wanted a good acronym, and they thought REM was okay. So we have 3 regular faculty members who participate in our lab meetings. Besides myself, Tamsin German, who's a cognitive and developmental psychologist from our psych and brain sciences department, and Ray Palutzian, who's a social psychologist emeritus from Westmont College. And our graduate students, most of them come from religious studies, but they come from different subfields within religious studies. So we do have a number of my graduate students who are doing North American religions, but we also have a couple of South Asianists, one doing Buddhism, the other doing Hinduism. We have an Islamicist. And then we have an anthropology graduate student and a psych graduate student. And this year we've had 2 entering psych graduate students who, as soon as their schedules work out, may be starting to participate. So we want to ramp up the psych participation. And we've also got a dissertation level student from Brazil who's in media studies and studying dissemination of religious concepts, and a postdoc for a 2-year postdoc who was a student of Wouter Hanegraaff's of esotericism at University of Amsterdam, who's interested in the cognitive basis of esotericism and religion and that kind of stuff. So it's a very dynamic group that brings a lot of different perspectives, not just the anthropological, psychological, and religious studies, but for me, one of the really important features is that it crosses the subfields in religious studies, which, you know, our field has tended to become more and more balkanized with, you know, different subspecialties isolated from one another. So I see the work we're doing in the lab as not only important for working between levels from the psychological into the more social scientific and humanistic, but also working laterally so that we can revitalize the comparative enterprise within religious studies. Certain other questions that we want to ask are inherently interdisciplinary, and if we don't ask them that way or recognize that they are interdisciplinary questions, we can't really get at good answers. Yeah. They often don't understand, and they're worried about certain things. I've been finding over time that the more they see what we're actually trying to do, the more sense it starts to make. But I'm also finding better ways, you know, over time to bridge. At least I think the ways are getting better. So it's a long process, and there's sensitivities, and I think there are important issues to be recognized on both sides. So a lot of it is is cross-cultural communications issues. Yes, I think it's really important, and there are a lot of people, for example, Lee Kirkpatrick, who've been arguing for quite a while that, for example, the psychology of religion needs to be undergirded by an evolutionary perspective. And I think most of the researchers who think in terms of cognitive science of religion have been assuming and developing that kind of perspective. Certainly the people in our lab group from psych are, I mean, they're in a cluster in psychology with Leda Kazmides and John Tooby. So we can hardly ignore an evolutionary perspective. But what I would add to that is that a lot of the research in the cognitive science of religion has tended to emphasize the minimally counterintuitive sorts of representations as the kind of foundational way for looking at religious representations. And I was quite impressed in reading one of Ben Brzezinski's articles when he pointed out that that approach in CSR is deliberately bracketing what he calls counterintuitive schemas, which are the things that within a culture are counterintuitive. And I think this is one of the things that tends to confuse people, and that he suggests that instead of the language of minimally counterintuitive concepts, that we refer to those more evolutionary concepts as counter-ontological, I think he calls it. The point being that we can distinguish between both the counter-ontological and the counter-schematic, and that these are constantly interacting with each other. And for me personally, recognizing that degree of complexity and beginning to investigate that degree of complexity is going to allow us to look at the way that evolutionary and cultural processes are interacting, which in terms of bridging between the sciences and humanities, I think that's a level of complexity we really need to start investigating more seriously. Part of the issue is a certain defensiveness or protectiveness that is grounded in what some scholars in religion would call a phenomenological approach, that wants to say we can interpret, we can describe, we can analyze, but we need to stay largely within a worldview that is acceptable to those we're studying. There are lots of criticisms of that. And many scholars of religion would recognize that Marx or Durkheim, that most of the social scientists are reducing in the same way that other sciences do. For myself, I always come back to, I start with Wayne Proudfoot's distinction between descriptive and explanatory reduction. So I always stress that this is not an either or kind of thing, and that, as Proudfoot pointed out, descriptive reduction is actually a really bad thing. I mean, descriptive reduction is when we don't actually start with what religious people are saying in the way that they're describing the world. And we actually do need to spend a bunch of time analyzing that in a way that would pretty much make sense to them. But then, as Proudfoot argues, we can step back and explain what we've analyzed in whatever terms we find compelling and make an argument for that explanation to a broader group of scientists or scholars or whomever is our audience. So for me, the issue is one of voice and giving voice to our subjects, taking seriously how they experience the world, because if we don't have anything to study. And then switching into our own voice that we find most persuasive analytically. In terms of the way I've been modifying or reconceptualizing that kind of approach in some of the work we've been doing, I've been talking ever since Religious Experience Reconsidered about a building block approach. And what I mean by that is a kind of circular process that includes both taking things apart to see how they work, see their smaller components, which would be reductionistic, and looking to see how individuals and groups have put those parts back together, assembled those building blocks to make things, to create things, to generate the kinds of formations, religious groups, movements, spiritual paths, but also construct academic disciplines. So all kinds of things, and it's a circular process where, in my view, the point isn't just to reduce or take apart, it's also to track how things are put together. Like James, I've always been fascinated by the unusual experiences. And when I wrote Fits, Trances, and Visions, way back in the 90s, a lot of people, or some people, responded to that book by saying, well, but those are just, the odd experiences. That's not what religion's really about. So, to some degree, this book is a counter argument to that, saying, hey guys, look, unusual experiences have played a big role in the beginning of a lot of religious movements or new spiritual paths, and we can't just say this is a marginal phenomenon when it comes to the study of religion. So that would be one sort of argument. But actually, this kind of building block approach that I'm taking to the study of experiences, experience events, and the broad way that we're starting to survey experiences in general, and the variety of appraisal processes that we're looking at, that not just religious or spiritual appraisals, but other kinds of appraisals that still contain, mark them as significant without considering them religious or spiritual, means that the general approach that I'm taking starts to work for any kind of experience. So I've had this odd experience myself of realizing that with the broader methods that we're developing, I can now start to talk about my own experience within the framework that we're developing, even though I don't necessarily consider it spiritual or religious or all that unusual, but I can bring myself into the picture and talk about my own experience in a way that's parallel to the way that I talk about, in the same framework as the one that I'm using to talk about people that have more unusual experiences. So yes, I'm working on a book project that's, it's coming along. It's getting close to being drafted. It's called Revelatory Events. The subtitle keeps changing, but I think it's going to be Experience and Appraisals in the Emergence of New Spiritual Paths. So it picks up on my general interest in experience and appraisal processes, but it construes experiences as a type of event, and it looks at the way that these events, events, get appraised and reappraised over time. And to do that, what I have to do is go back and reconstruct the process of emergence of some particular spiritual paths. So I'm looking at three: early Mormonism, Alcoholics Anonymous, and A Course in Miracles. And all three had a key figure who had unusual experiences and who very soon was involved with a small group, an expanding group of collaborators. And then over time, in each of these cases, a larger kind of path emerged. So what I'm looking at is the way that experience gets appraised and reappraised, not just by the individual or individuals who had the experience, but by the small group that's interacting, and how they're coming to common appraisals, at least for those who then become a part of the group, because there are also competing people around who appraise these events rather differently, who are the contemporary critics who say, no, 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 Joseph Smith didn't find golden plates. They were actually, he made them. So I'm looking both at the people who appraise it in common and the people who appraise it differently. And the book is going to have two parts. The largest part is going to be this fine-grained sort of descriptive analysis of the way that these different groups develop over time. And then the last part is going to be an explanatory analysis where I look at the interaction of processes that I think are involved, that we can see if we compare the three groups and the kinds of processes that they draw on as they emerge.